Welcome back to Hidden Edge Poker. I'm Francesco Lacriola, professional poker player and coach. One of the most common spots in which I see a ton of players, including my students, struggle are spots which involve a ton of complexity. Usually, players tend to either try to replicate whatever they see without fully understanding the nuances and ending up getting lost in all the complexity, or on the other hand, they understand that this is not replicable for a human, therefore they try to find a simplification and learn a strategy. But of course, both of these approaches have drawbacks and are missing the point here. They're missing the framework. What we see here is not a single blend of what you can do, but it's a sort of menu of strategies. So we're not trying to execute a mix, but we need to understand that each strategy is linked to a coherent plan with its own goal. So each sizing is connected to every strategy. Therefore, we can choose one and play it well. So the first thing we can see here is that there is a sort of convergence toward the high end of the spectrum of sizings between small overbet and 2/3 of the pot. So in general, this sizing can converge around pot or small overbet, and then there's a minor part which wants to bet small. You can see that the most frequent action here is the check. So we can kind of already discount a simplified strategy that involves a range bet because the in-position player will really not have problems to defend. So if we see, for example, the small bet, we can already start to see that in position has to raise a ton and find also some races which can be played with hands which can be played in a passive way, such as a7, even something like King Jack, King 10. So for a player, it might be more intuitive to raise a draw, it might be more intuitive to raise a strong hand, but for other players, it's quite hard, for example, to find these hands if they're not familiar with the equilibrium. And also another thing you can see is that combos such as 9-8, which is a pretty strong combo being top 2 pair, is not being fast played 100% of the time. Again, this might be also another common mistake that players make against the small bet. Therefore, the small bet, if we want to see what the small bet wants to do, we need to do AI solve and force a sim with a small bet. As you can see, the betting frequency with our range went up significantly. And you can see that most combos that were before checking now started to bet. Combos such as ace-king, ace-queen, ace-jack, ace-10, king-queen, king-jack. So the idea of this bet is to try to realize more equity cheaply. And the whole premise of this strategy is that we're trying to lean on a passive big blind who is going to under-raise the flop, float less, or even if they float, they let us over-realize equity. So we are hoping that if they float, they're going to be more passive on later streets. Therefore, they're not going to attack our weaker range once we check the turn. We can see that against the bet, villain has to find even uncomfortable calls such as King 10 without a backdoor, which goes between float and raise. So if we assume that villain is only defending backdoor hands, not finding enough raises, then betting small makes a lot of sense. And the small bet has a higher tolerance for mistakes. So if we see bet a bit too much, it's better to do that when we bet small rather than when we're betting big and strengthening the calling range significantly. So again, the mistakes we can see are on different hands, but mostly rely on a lack of aggression with the weaker hands, such as this King 10, King Jack without the backdoor, and missing these backdoor raises as well. You can see a lot of these low aces are finding these lines in general. And again, the idea is that once they raise, they already put a ton of pressure on this ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen, king-jack fold immediately. So the idea of this raise, of course, is to put a ton of pressure on this hand. But again, they're not polarizing all the time, because if they always raise two pairs, then their calling range is going to be much weaker, and therefore they're going to struggle on a lot of turns. Also, you can see that, for example, if we get a blank turn, now let's say we start to polarize, a wizard like this geometric sizing, we can even put something like smaller overbet here, but you can see that in general we're supposed to check anyway a bunch of quite often, let's say, and in position starts to stub once we check. And again, you can see that those hands exactly that we were indicating as flop floats, such as king 10 without the spade, etc., now start to bluff. So let's say they bet and they push us off equity with the ace king, king queen. So the idea is that, you know, if you bet too much with this sizing, villain defends appropriately, then they can pressure out of these hands on blank turns whenever you check, and you're going to struggle to defend because your range is going to be very wide. And another mistake you need to avoid, of course, is that you want to check sometimes with reasonable hands, because otherwise your checking range is going to be unprotected. This happens also on the flop. You can see that there are no pure bets. So against the check, here we have a b 2/3. We can also say, maybe let's see what happens if villain bets 40%. The strategy is not going to shift a ton. You can see from 36.4% we go to 44.8%. So we have a slight increase, but mostly villain is still checking. And you can already see something interesting here, which is that villain is not betting 100% of their good top pairs. And this is where a ton of beginners go wrong, because you might see weak players, but even some intermediate players who stub too often when check 2 on this board, starting to fire the middling portion of the range, meaning these top pairs, board pairs in general, and draws fair to freely. There is an exploit to this strategy, which we will see right now. In order to see that, what we want to do is node lock. We force a pure bet with hands like this, for example. So in theory, we're just strengthening the range, right? Because we're betting top pairs, we are betting open-enders. Well, we can also increase flush draws, but for now, let's just stick to that. So big blinds betting frequency goes slightly up, but we're not adding some garbage hands here. And what you can see already is that the betting frequency from the small blind goes down a little bit. So the idea is that we want to punish them by check raising very aggressively because they are putting the money in for us. But this is even more relevant when we bet big on the flop. So if we check a pot size bet, we can clearly see that this betting strategy is mostly built around ace 9 plus for value. And you can see that the aces that before were trying to push some equity right now are mostly checking, except the weaker ones with backdoors, which are trying, of course, to fold better hands and potentially barrel with the ace of hearts on flush completing runouts. But you can see that we have the same pattern, that these overpairs are checking a bunch because, again, in position, not supposed to stop these ones all the time, but when they do, we have some check raising frequency, and sometimes we even call them. So you can see that in equilibrium here we have only around 12% of raise frequency, but again, this pattern that we were describing before becomes even more relevant if we play a polarized bet on the flop, and we can just see what happens now by node locking again. Again, just a tiny increase. We just put pure bets with the king 9 plus. We just put pure bet with jack 10, 7, 6. And we can see that the betting frequency goes down even more. This can be even put to the extreme with a full range check if we assume that villain gets even wider by betting even more of top pairs. Like, this is very common against recreational player profiles. They will see this board, they will see their top pair, feel that it's marginal and needs protection, therefore they're gonna start betting before overcards come. So we can even do a more extreme node lock, and right now we have almost all top pairs betting there. So again, we're not adding bluffs, but what you can see is that the small blind now checks 100% with the idea of raising extremely aggressively there. So even King 9 is qualified to raise for value. And again, now we already fold right away some of the strong aces because villain is betting too much mid-value. Therefore, floating out of position with hands without backdoor is not really a great play. How we want to handle this is by raising. Therefore, we check our all range and counter their over-aggression with an aggressive check-raising strategy. This strategy, again, does not exist at equilibrium. At equilibrium, we saw that check-raising exists, but it was an option. So we saw it was around 12% of our checking range, which is not the entire range we get there because we're supposed to have a betting range at equilibrium. But you can see that as an exploit here, it makes a ton of sense to check our entire range if we expect villain to bet too often and crush player that is putting too much money in with the middle portion of their range and betting too many draws, too many dominated pairs. If we play against a passive player, betting big is crucial because they're going to check back their draws, they're going to check back all their weak pairs. So instead of hoping for them to put money into the pot for you and attacking them with a check raise, it's better to bet big ourselves. But of course, this has a drawback because in theory, we're supposed to bet big rarely. As you saw before, we bet less than 30% of the time with a pot size bet, therefore we need to protect the check. And this is more important against competent players than against passive opponents because again, against passive opponents we don't care too much about protecting the check because their betting range is going to be stronger than what it should be, therefore we can comfortably fold to aggression whenever we have a medium strength hand. An important thing to see here is how ranges interact with the board, and you can see that the small blind has an equity advantage. And how is this equity advantage distributed? It's basically higher in all the portion of the range except in the absolute top end because both players tend to have roughly a similar amount of top two pairs because both players will have 9-8 offsuit, both players can have pocket 9s, pocket 8s and pocket 4s. I mean, the small blind will always open those hands, the big blind can 3-bet a bunch of pocket 9s and pocket 8s, but still, considering that they have position, this doesn't matter much. So that's why you have a lot of options, because you have the equity advantage, which in theory allows you to bet small and push equity. But at the same time, the real advantage that you have are the overpair. So you have an advantage in the medium-high part of the range where you have this overpairs, let's say kings, queens, over the ace-9. So the problem of this texture is that this texture is very dynamic. Therefore, when we go and bet big, you can already see that we start to make some gut shots, even with double overcard, indifferent on the flop. And of course, the bigger the size, let's say if we start to bet 120% instead of pot, you would see that these combos fold even more often. So the bigger the size, the more vulnerable these combos are to the size. And this even goes as much as second pair that without a backdoor starts to fold pretty often against a small overbet. So in terms of EV, it doesn't change that much, but you must be aware of this, especially if you are on the big blind facing this bet. And one of the ideas again is that on turns like this, you can still pressure your opponent and charge the most out of their draws. The problem of betting small, of course, is that it becomes problematic to play on draw completing runouts, but with a big bet, you start to fold out already an open-ender on the turn, because we put two big bets, so 7-6 is now supposed to fold. Therefore, if you get a 5 river, the 5 river starts to become a blank. On the other hand, if we bet small, then intermediate on the turn, villain is never folding 7-6, so you have to be worried not only of the flush, not only of Jack 10 completing, but also of 7-6, and sometimes even of gutshots, especially if you don't size up. On the turn, villain is able, in some configurations, to defend combos such as Queen Jack and Queen 10 against intermediate size bets. So, if you want to leverage the overpair advantage, you want to at least get rid of some of the most awkward draws in the opponent's range. Whenever you get draw completing turns, you want to size down. So if on blanks we keep overbetting and putting a ton of money into the pot with our overpairs, on these turns we still want to bet most of our overpairs, but we want to be careful, and we realize that now we're not playing for stacks against ace-9 anymore, but we need to be careful. So you see, we size a little bit down on the straight completing, and the worse the turn is for us, the lower we need to size and the more we need to check. You can see that the 5 also completes another open-ender on the flop. However, the difference is that we don't have 7-6 offsuit in our opening range, but villain defends it from the big blind. Therefore, villains will have a nut advantage on this turn. Therefore, our betting frequency goes down. And again, you see, we don't bet pot, we don't overbet, but we are going to bet 2/3 or even 40% is very reasonable here. You are not going to lose much EV if you size down on these straight completing turns, and especially on flush completing turns. In fact, you can see that already the preferred size goes even down on a flush completing turn. But again, the idea is that our overpairs still have a good amount of equity against villain's range. Therefore, these hands still mostly want to bet, but of course we have to be careful if we face aggression, because obviously this is something that can happen. Or also, let's say on the river again, we also want to use this small bet. Again, we're building around ace-9. I would say king-9 starts to be kind of indifferent to bet, but we will see this line pretty often, and you can see that overpairs with the heart are just bluff catchers at the end. Like, it's not we're planning to play for stacks, but we have to be careful and understand that, of course, on the river still our hands have enough equity to value bet on this run out at least, but once we face an all-in raise, villain is essentially representing a flush or a bluff. Therefore, it doesn't matter if you have pocket kings, it doesn't matter if you have pocket queens, it doesn't matter if you have ace-9. Those hands are all bluff catchers, so we judge them by, first of all, we need to understand whether we expect villain to bluff enough, because if villain under bluffs, then there is no need to defend any of these bluff catchers. On the other hand, if villain bluffs and we assume that they're kind of balanced, then we need to choose the best blockers to the value hands and the best unblockers to the bluffing hands. This, of course, if we expect them to be balanced. On the other hand, if they're just bluffing too much, then any of these combos with a heart is a reasonable candidate for a call, and villain cannot even know that we're exploiting them, because in theory those hands are legitimate calls as a randomization. But of course, if we have a read, we don't need to randomize, and we can choose whatever option we feel the best. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and join our Discord, where we also discuss strategy in depth.